At 9:30 a.m. on March 13, 1996, a man walked into a primary school gymnasium in Dunblane, Scotland. Within minutes, 16 children and one teacher were dead. The children were 5 and 6 years old. They had been participating in a physical education class. The attack lasted approximately 3 minutes. When police arrived, the shooter was already dead. This was not a random act, and it was not unforeseeable. Dunblane is a small cathedral city in the Stirling Council area of Scotland, located approximately 5 miles north of the city of Stirling itself. In 1996, the population was around 9,000 people. It was the kind of community where neighbors knew each other, where children played in the streets, and where the rhythms of daily life moved with a predictable, comforting regularity. The town sits at the foot of the Ochil Hills, surrounded by natural beauty that had attracted families for generations. It was considered a safe place to raise children, a place largely untouched by the kind of violence that occasionally erupted in larger cities. The high street contained the usual array of shops that served a small Scottish town: bakeries, newsagents, a post office, several pubs and small businesses that had operated for decades under the same family ownership. The cathedral, Dunblane Cathedral, dates back to the 12th century and serves as both a historical landmark and an active place of worship. It stands as a testament to the town's long history, a continuity that residents took pride in. The surrounding countryside offered walking paths, fishing opportunities in the Allan Water that runs through the town, and a general sense of pastoral tranquility. People moved to Dunblane specifically for its quality of life, its schools, and its distance from urban problems. It was, by almost any measure, an unremarkable place where unremarkable things happened day after day. Dunblane Primary School was established in the 19th century and served the local community as the main primary education facility for children aged 4 to 12. The school building itself was Victorian in architecture, with additions and modifications made over the decades to accommodate growing enrollment and changing educational needs. By the mid-1990s, it educated several hundred pupils from the town and surrounding areas. The school was integrated into the fabric of community life. Parents volunteered regularly. School events drew crowds. Teachers lived locally and often remained at the school for their entire careers. The classrooms were typical of British primary schools of that era: bright displays of children's work on walls, reading corners with worn carpets, desks arranged in groups to encourage collaborative learning. The gymnasium where the attack occurred was a separate building connected to the main school structure. It was used for physical education classes, school assemblies, and community events. On the morning of March 13th, Primary 1 students were scheduled for their regular gym period. Primary 1 is the Scottish equivalent of what would be called kindergarten or reception class in other systems. These were the youngest children in the school, most of them still adjusting to the routines of formal education. They arrived at school that morning in their gym uniforms, small backpacks containing their regular clothes for changing after class. Their teacher, Gwyneth Mayer, had taught at Dunblane Primary School for many years and was respected and loved by students and parents alike. There was nothing unusual about that morning. Parents dropped children at the school gates. Some children walked with older siblings or friends. The weather was cold but clear, typical for mid-March in central Scotland. Inside the school, teachers prepared for their lessons. Administrative staff handled attendance records and daily communications. The kitchen staff began preparations for lunch service. In the gymnasium, Gwyneth Mayer organized equipment for the physical education class. The children gathered, excited as young children typically are for gym class, an opportunity to run and play under supervised conditions. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Nothing suggested that within minutes, this ordinary morning would become the site of one of the worst mass murders in British history. The perpetrator was Thomas Watt Hamilton, a man who was 43 years old at the time of the attack. He had lived in the Stirling area for most of his life and was known to many residents of Dunblane and surrounding communities. Hamilton had operated youth clubs and camps for boys over a period of approximately 2 decades. He advertised these clubs as opportunities for boys to participate in outdoor activities, sports, and physical training. He held these clubs in various locations. including school facilities that he rented for evening and weekend sessions. Parents enrolled their sons in these programs, viewing them as constructive activities that would build confidence and physical fitness. Hamilton presented himself as someone dedicated to youth development. He often wore quasi-military clothing and organized his clubs with a structured, disciplined approach. He took photographs of the boys, ostensibly to document activities and provide mementos for parents. He maintained correspondence with various officials, seeking recognition and support for his programs. On the surface, he appeared to be an eccentric but well-meaning individual, pursuing what he described as important work with young people. He was not a stranger to the community. He was not an outsider who appeared without warning. He was a known entity, someone whose name and activities were familiar to parents, teachers, and local officials throughout the region. However, beneath this public presentation, there existed a documented history of concerning behavior that stretched back years before the attack. What mattered most was not who he was, but what was already known about him. By 1996, concerns had already been raised, not once, not twice, repeatedly. Parents had complained about Hamilton's behavior with their children. Multiple families had removed their sons from his clubs after becoming uncomfortable with his conduct. The nature of these concerns centered on his insistence on physical contact during activities, his practice of photographing boys in states of undress, and behavior that parents found inappropriate and unsettling. These were not vague suspicions whispered in private. These were formal complaints made to relevant authorities. In 1988, Hamilton's involvement with the Scout Association ended after concerns were raised about his suitability to work with children. The Scout Association conducted an investigation and concluded that Hamilton should not be permitted to lead youth activities under their organization. This was a significant red flag, representing a formal determination by a major youth organization that Hamilton posed risks in contexts involving children. The reasons for his removal were documented. The concerns were specific. The decision was not based on minor infractions or personality conflicts, but on substantive worries about his behavior and judgment. Following his removal from the Scouts, Hamilton continued to operate independent boys' clubs without organizational oversight. He rented facilities from local schools and community centers. He advertised in local newspapers and through word of mouth. Without the structure and safeguarding procedures of an established organization, Hamilton had greater freedom to operate according to his own preferences. Parents who enrolled their children were often unaware of his history with the Scout Association. There was no mechanism for sharing information about individuals deemed unsuitable for youth work across different organizations and contexts. Between 1988 and 1996, additional complaints accumulated. Parents contacted local police expressing concerns about Hamilton. Letters were written to local council members. School officials were approached with questions about why Hamilton was permitted to rent school facilities. In 1991, police visited Hamilton regarding complaints about his behavior. The visit resulted in no formal action. In 1992, further complaints prompted another police inquiry. Again, no charges were filed. The complaints continued. Hamilton himself was aware that his reputation was under scrutiny. He wrote lengthy letters defending his activities and accusing those who questioned him of conducting a campaign against him. He threatened legal action against individuals who spoke negatively about his clubs. The pattern was clear. Multiple independent sources raised alarms about the same individual engaged in the same type of activity. These sources included parents who had initially trusted Hamilton enough to enroll their children, then became concerned enough to not only withdraw their children but to formally complain. These were not casual observations. These were serious allegations made by responsible adults who felt compelled to alert authorities to what they perceived as dangerous behavior. The complaints were consistent in their themes. They pointed to inappropriate physical contact, to photographing children in vulnerable situations, to behavior that suggested motivations beyond legitimate youth development work. The system that existed in 1996 to address such concerns was fragmented and inadequate. In the United Kingdom at that time, there was no comprehensive national database of individuals deemed unsuitable for work with children. Organizations like the Scouts maintained their own records. But these were not automatically shared with other youth organizations, schools, or licensing authorities. Police maintained records of complaints and investigations, but unless charges were filed and convictions obtained, this information was not systematically used to restrict an individual's access to children through other channels. Local education authorities made decisions about facility rentals based primarily on availability and payment, with limited background checking procedures. The legal framework governing firearms was also less restrictive than it would later become. Hamilton held licenses for multiple handguns. To obtain these licenses, he had undergone background checks conducted by local police firearms licensing departments. These checks focused primarily on criminal history and whether there were specific reasons to believe an applicant posed a danger to public safety. Hamilton had no criminal convictions. The complaints made against him had not resulted in charges. Therefore, from the perspective of firearms licensing criteria as they existed at the time, there was insufficient basis to deny him gun ownership. The system operated in silos. Information held by one part of the system was not effectively communicated to other parts that might have used that information to make different decisions. Central Scotland Police, the force responsible for the Dunblane area, had files on Hamilton. These files documented the complaints, the visits made to his residence, and the concerns raised by community members. Officers who dealt with Hamilton found him difficult and argumentative. He insisted on his rights and threatened litigation against those he felt were treating him unfairly. The culture of policing at that time emphasized avoiding unwarranted intrusion into citizens' lives. Without sufficient evidence to bring criminal charges, police were limited in their ability to take preventive action. The threshold for intervention was high. The presumption was that individuals were entitled to pursue their activities unless and until they committed a prosecutable offense. This created a situation where Hamilton, despite being the subject of repeated complaints and despite being judged unsuitable for youth work by a major organization, continued to have legal access to both children and firearms. The information existed, the action did not. Different agencies held pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, presented a troubling picture. But there was no mechanism requiring or even encouraging the assembly of those pieces. There was no procedure mandating that firearms licensing authorities consult with child protection services or vice versa. There was no requirement that schools renting facilities to individuals for youth activities verify whether those individuals had been the subject of safeguarding concerns. On the morning of March 13, 1996, Hamilton drove to Dunblane Primary School. He arrived shortly after 9:00 a.m. He parked his vehicle in the car park adjacent to the school. He was carrying 4 handguns and a large quantity of ammunition. He walked toward the school buildings. Teachers and staff were aware of his presence, but had no reason at that moment to perceive him as an immediate threat. Hamilton had previously rented school facilities for his clubs. His presence on school grounds was not unprecedented. There was no security protocol that would have prevented his entry. Schools in 1996 were generally open environments. The idea of securing schools against armed intrusion was not part of standard practice in Britain. Hamilton entered the gymnasium where the Primary 1 class was in session. Gwyneth Mayer was supervising approximately 28 children engaged in physical education activities. Hamilton opened fire immediately upon entering. He fired more than 100 rounds in a matter of minutes. The children and their teacher had no warning and no opportunity to flee or take cover. The gymnasium became a scene of indescribable horror. 15 children died at the scene. A 16th child died later from injuries. Gwyneth Mayer died attempting to shield her students. 12 other children and 3 other adults were injured, some seriously. Hamilton moved through the school briefly after the initial attack in the gymnasium, firing additional shots into a classroom and other areas. Teachers, acting with extraordinary courage, worked to evacuate children and secure them in locked classrooms. Some staff members encountered Hamilton directly and survived only because his attention was focused elsewhere or because they managed to reach safety before being targeted. The entire sequence of violence lasted approximately 3 to 4 minutes. Hamilton then returned to the gymnasium and shot himself. When police arrived minutes later, they found a scene of devastation that would haunt first responders, medical personnel, and investigators for the rest of their lives. The emergency response was immediate and massive. Police, ambulance services, and fire personnel converged on the school. The injured were transported to nearby hospitals. The deceased were left in place as the scene became a criminal investigation site, though the perpetrator's suicide meant there would be no prosecution. Parents were notified and directed to assembly points where they could be reunited with their children or, in the most terrible cases, informed of their deaths. The town streets filled with emergency vehicles. News of the attack spread rapidly through the community and then nationally. Within hours, Dunblane was under intense media scrutiny, with journalists from across Britain and internationally descending on the small town. The immediate response of the emergency services was widely praised as professional and compassionate under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Counselors and support services were mobilized for survivors, families of victims, school staff, and first responders. The community came together in shock and grief. Memorial services were held. The gymnasium where the attack occurred was demolished and replaced with a memorial garden. The school remained closed for an extended period, while physical repairs were made, and while the community grappled with whether and how to resume normal schooling in a place forever marked by tragedy. As the initial shock began to give way to questions about how such an attack could have occurred, attention turned to Hamilton's history and to the system's prior knowledge of him. Journalists began investigating. Families of victims demanded answers. It became apparent that Hamilton had not been an unknown quantity, that concerns had been raised, that warnings had been issued. The question was not whether information existed, but why that information had not resulted in action that might have prevented the tragedy. Reporters obtained documents showing the complaints made to police. They interviewed parents who had withdrawn their children from Hamilton's clubs years earlier. They reviewed correspondence between Hamilton and various officials. A picture emerged of a man who had been the subject of sustained concern, yet who had remained free to operate and to maintain access to firearms. The Scottish Office, the government department responsible for Scottish affairs at that time, announced that there would be a public inquiry into the events leading up to the attack and into the attack itself. Lord Cullen, a senior Scottish judge, was appointed to lead the inquiry. The Cullen inquiry, as it became known, was given a broad mandate to examine all aspects of the case, including Hamilton's background, the complaints made against him, the firearms licensing system, school security, and emergency response procedures. The inquiry had the power to compel testimony and to access confidential documents. It was tasked with producing a comprehensive report that would establish the facts and make recommendations to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The inquiry held public hearings over several months in 1996. Witnesses included police officers who had dealt with Hamilton, officials from the Scout Association, parents who had complained about him, firearms licensing authorities, school officials, and experts in various relevant fields. The hearings were attended by families of victims and by members of the media. The testimony was often painful, revealing the extent to which warning signs had been present and the degree to which the system had failed to act on those warnings. Police officers acknowledged that complaints had been received, but explained the limitations they faced in taking action without sufficient evidence for criminal charges. Firearms licensing officials described the criteria they used and the information they had access to at the time they granted Hamilton's licenses. The Scout Association provided detailed testimony about its decision to remove Hamilton from involvement with their organization. Representatives explained that their internal investigation had concluded that Hamilton's behavior was inappropriate and that he posed a risk to children. They had communicated this decision to Hamilton, but had no mechanism or obligation to share this information with other organizations or with authorities outside their own structure. The testimony revealed a system in which serious safeguarding concerns could be identified and acted upon within one organization, yet remain unknown to other organizations and to public authorities who might have used that information differently. Parents who had withdrawn their children from Hamilton's clubs testified about the specific behaviors that had alarmed them. They described their attempts to alert authorities and their frustration at what they perceived as inadequate responses. Some testified that they had been warned by police to be careful about making public statements about Hamilton because he might sue for defamation. This created a chilling effect, discouraging parents from sharing information that might have warned others or prompted more decisive action. The legal environment favored individuals accused of improper behavior unless and until formal charges were brought, creating a high barrier to public discussion of concerns. Firearms experts testified about the guns Hamilton had used and about the licensing process. They explained that Hamilton had held firearms certificates for several years, and that these had been renewed periodically following standard review procedures. The experts noted that the system focused on criminal history and specific intelligence about threats, but did not systematically consider broader character or suitability concerns. There was no requirement that firearms licensing authorities consult with social services, child protection agencies, or youth organizations when evaluating applicants. The system was designed to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and those with documented mental health crises requiring hospitalization, but it was not designed to consider patterns of concerning behavior that fell short of criminal conviction. The inquiry also examined security measures at schools. In 1996, schools in Scotland and throughout the United Kingdom were generally open institutions with minimal physical security. There were no locked entrance systems, no security personnel, and no protocols for screening visitors. The assumption was that schools were safe community spaces that did not require fortification. The Dunblane attack shattered that assumption, but the inquiry had to examine whether and how schools could be made more secure without fundamentally changing their nature as accessible community institutions. Experts testified about various security measures used in other contexts and other countries, discussing their effectiveness, their costs, and their potential impacts on the educational environment. The Cullen Report was published in October 1996. It was a comprehensive document running to hundreds of pages, detailing the facts of the case, analyzing the systemic failures, and making numerous recommendations. The report confirmed that Hamilton had been the subject of multiple complaints over many years. It confirmed that police had investigated but had not taken formal action. It confirmed that Hamilton had been removed from the Scout Association due to safeguarding concerns. It confirmed that this information had not been integrated or used to restrict Hamilton's access to either children or firearms. The report did not assign criminal responsibility to any individual or organization, as Hamilton himself was solely responsible for the murders he committed. However, it did identify significant failures in systems and procedures. The report's primary recommendations focused on firearms legislation. Lord Cullen concluded that there was no legitimate reason for private citizens to own handguns of the type used in the attack. He recommended a ban on the private ownership of all handguns except those of the smallest calibers, and even those only under restricted circumstances. He argued that the risks posed by widespread handgun ownership outweighed any sporting or collecting interests. The report also recommended improvements to the firearms licensing process, including better information sharing between police departments and other agencies, more rigorous background checks, and higher standards for determining suitability. Regarding child protection, the report recommended better information sharing between organizations involved with children and youth. It called for the development of systems that would flag individuals who had been deemed unsuitable by one organization to prevent them from simply moving to another organization or operating independently. It recommended that schools exercise greater caution in renting facilities to individuals for youth activities, and that they implement background checking procedures. The report called for improved training for police officers dealing with child protection concerns, and for clearer protocols about when and how to escalate concerns that fell short of prosecutable offences. On school security, the report made more limited recommendations. Lord Cullen recognised that schools could not be turned into fortresses, and that excessive security measures might harm the educational environment. He recommended enhanced visitor management procedures, better staff training on responding to threats, and improved communication systems for emergencies. He stopped short of recommending armed security or highly restrictive entry systems, judging these to be disproportionate and inconsistent with the educational mission of schools. The report acknowledged that no security system could provide absolute protection against a determined attacker, but that reasonable measures could reduce risks. The British government responded to the Cullen report with legislation. The Firearms Amendment Act of 1997 banned the private ownership of most handguns in mainland Britain. Existing owners were required to surrender their weapons, with compensation provided. The ban was one of the strictest firearms control measures in any democracy. It effectively ended handgun ownership as a common activity in Britain. Sport shooters who had legally owned handguns for target practice found their weapons illegal overnight. The legislation was controversial among shooting sports enthusiasts who argued that law-abiding gun owners were being punished for the actions of one criminal. However, public opinion strongly supported the ban, and it passed through Parliament with substantial majorities. The government also implemented measures to improve child protection information sharing. The Protection of Children Act 1999 established a national system for identifying individuals considered unsuitable to work with children. Organizations providing services to children were required to check applicants against this list. The system was not perfect and would require further refinement in subsequent years, but it represented a significant improvement over the fragmented approach that had existed in 1996. Police procedures for handling child protection concerns were updated, with better guidance on information sharing and on engagement with other agencies. Schools throughout Britain reviewed and enhanced their security procedures. While stopping short of the fortress model, schools implemented visitor sign-in systems, improved perimeter security, and developed lockdown procedures for use in emergencies. Staff received training on recognizing and responding to potential threats. Communication systems were upgraded to allow rapid contact with emergency services. These changes became standard practice, representing a permanent shift in how schools approached safety and security. The open, unrestricted access that had characterized British schools for generations was replaced with a more controlled, monitored approach to who entered school buildings and when. The impact on Dunblane itself was profound and lasting. The community was traumatized by the attack and by its aftermath. Families who lost children struggled with grief that would never fully heal. Survivors carried physical and psychological scars. Teachers who had been present that day, who had witnessed the carnage or who had worked to save children, dealt with trauma that affected their ability to continue in the profession. The town became internationally known for a single terrible event, forever associated with tragedy rather than with its history, its cathedral, or its natural beauty. Residents grew weary of media attention, of anniversary commemorations, of being defined by the worst day in their community's history. Yet the community also demonstrated resilience. Dunblane Primary School reopened. Children returned to class. Teachers continued to teach. The memorial garden created where the gymnasium once stood became a place of quiet reflection rather than of public spectacle. Families found ways to honor their lost children while also moving forward with their lives, understanding that their children would not have wanted the entire community to remain frozen in grief. Support networks that formed in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy continued for years, providing ongoing assistance to those affected. The community worked consciously to reclaim its identity, to be known for more than that one day in March. The broader impact on British society was significant. The Dunblane massacre, as it became known, shattered assumptions about safety and about the nature of threats facing communities. Prior to 1996, mass shootings in schools were primarily associated with the United States, not with Britain. The attack forced a national conversation about violence, about mental health, about child protection, and about gun control. It demonstrated that horrific violence could occur anywhere, that no community was immune, and that prevention required vigilance and robust systems rather than complacency. The firearms legislation that followed Dunblane remains in effect and is widely credited with keeping Britain's rate of gun violence low compared to many other countries. Britain has not experienced another school shooting since 1996. Handgun crime, while not eliminated, remains rare. The legislation is periodically cited in international debates about gun control as an example of decisive action following tragedy. Whether the ban was the primary factor in preventing subsequent attacks or whether other factors were equally important, remains debated among researchers and policy analysts. However, the correlation between the ban and the absence of similar incidents is noted by those who advocate for stronger firearms regulations. The child protection reforms implemented after Dunblane contributed to a broader transformation of safeguarding practices in Britain. Subsequent tragedies and scandals involving children prompted additional reforms, including the establishment of more comprehensive vetting and barring systems, mandatory reporting requirements, and integrated information sharing across agencies. The principle that emerged from Dunblane, that information about risk must be shared across organizational boundaries, became foundational to modern safeguarding practice. While no system is perfect, and while horrific failures of child protection continue to occur, the framework that exists today is substantially more robust than what existed in 1996. The legacy of Dunblane includes ongoing debates about what more could have been done and what lessons remain unlearned. Some argue that the focus on firearms, while important, obscured other systemic failures related to mental health, social isolation, and the inadequate response to warning signs. Hamilton exhibited behaviors over many years that should have triggered more intensive intervention, yet the system's response was reactive and fragmented. Questions remain about whether better mental health services, more assertive police action, or different legal standards for intervention might have prevented the tragedy even without changes to firearms laws. Others point to the broader cultural issues that the case illuminated. Hamilton was able to operate for years, despite raising concerns, because individuals and institutions were reluctant to act decisively based on suspicions and patterns rather than proof. The threat of litigation, the presumption of innocence, and the cultural preference for non-interference all contributed to a situation where warning signs were noted but not acted upon. These cultural factors extend beyond any single case and reflect ongoing tensions between individual rights and collective safety, between avoiding false accusations and preventing harm. The 20th anniversary of the massacre in 2016 prompted renewed reflection on what had changed and what challenges remained. Survivors who had been 5 and 6 years old in 1996 were now adults sharing their experiences. Teachers who had been present that day, some of whom had left the profession, spoke about the lasting impact. The community held private memorial services, resisting the urge to turn the anniversary into a media spectacle. Analysis of the firearms legislation showed that handgun crime remained low and that Britain had not experienced another mass shooting in a school. Child protection professionals discussed progress made in safeguarding, but also acknowledged continuing challenges in identifying and responding to risk. Research into mass violence and into prevention strategies has advanced significantly since 1996. Threat assessment methodologies have been developed and refined. Understanding of warning behaviors, of grievance-driven violence, and of the pathways to extreme acts has deepened. However, prediction remains imperfect. Many individuals exhibit concerning behaviors without ever committing violence. Systems designed to identify potential perpetrators must balance sensitivity with specificity, must avoid stigmatizing mental illness or other characteristics, and must operate within legal and ethical constraints. The challenge of prevention remains as complex as it is critical. The Dunblane case continues to be studied in courses on criminology, public policy, child protection, and emergency management. It serves as a case study in systemic failure, in the importance of information sharing, and in the challenges of prevention. The case is notable not only for the horror of the attack itself, but for the clear evidence that the perpetrator was known to authorities, that concerns had been raised, and that the system failed to integrate information or act on patterns. This makes Dunblane distinct from cases involving perpetrators who were truly unknown or whose warning signs were subtle or ambiguous. Hamilton's dangerousness was recognized by some who encountered him, yet he remained free to commit mass murder. The families of the victims have generally maintained privacy over the years, declining most media requests and choosing to remember their children privately rather than publicly. Some family members became advocates for gun control or for child protection reforms, using their painful experience to push for changes they believed might prevent similar tragedies. Others withdrew from public life entirely, seeking to rebuild their lives away from the spotlight. The diversity of responses reflects the individual nature of grief and the different ways people find meaning or cope with devastating loss. Dunblane Primary School continues to operate as a thriving educational institution. The decision to rebuild and continue, rather than to close the school permanently, was deliberate and symbolic. The community chose not to let the actions of one individual destroy an institution that had served generations of children. Current students learn in classrooms not far from where the attack occurred, though the gymnasium where it happened no longer exists. The school's existence represents resilience and the determination not to be defined solely by tragedy. Teachers work to create a positive, nurturing environment while being conscious of the school's history. Parents send their children there with confidence that the institution is safe and that the past, while never forgotten, does not prevent the future. The investigation into Hamilton's background and motivations revealed a man who had become increasingly isolated and aggrieved in the years before the attack. His letters to officials were often lengthy, paranoid, and accusatory. He believed himself to be the victim of a campaign to destroy his reputation and his youth work. He blamed parents who had complained about him, officials who had questioned him, and organizations that had rejected him. His grievance was not directed at any specific individual, but rather at the system and the community that had, in his view, unfairly persecuted him. The attack on the school, and specifically on the youngest children, appeared designed to inflict maximum pain on the community he blamed for his perceived mistreatment. This pattern of grievance leading to mass violence is now better understood than it was in 1996. Research has identified grievance as a common factor in targeted violence, particularly when combined with social isolation, access to weapons, and a mindset that blames external forces for personal failures. Hamilton's case fits this pattern clearly. He had suffered setbacks that he attributed to others, rather than to his own behavior. He became increasingly fixated on his grievances. He had access to weapons that allowed him to act on his violent impulses. The combination proved lethal. Whether Hamilton specifically intended to target that particular class, or whether his choice of victims was more random within the school, remains unclear. Some analysis suggests he may have chosen the youngest children precisely because they were the most innocent and vulnerable, maximizing the horror and grief his attack would cause. Others suggest the timing and location may have been more opportunistic, based on when he arrived and where he first encountered a group of children. His motives died with him, leaving only speculation based on his documented grievances and the nature of his attack. The question of whether mental illness played a role in Hamilton's actions has been extensively debated. He was never formally diagnosed with any psychiatric condition during his lifetime. He did not have a history of psychiatric hospitalization. He functioned independently, maintained a home, and operated his youth clubs. By legal and medical standards of the time, he would not have been considered mentally ill in a way that would have prompted involuntary treatment or that would have automatically disqualified him from firearms ownership. However, his behavior, particularly in the years before the attack, suggested paranoia, narcissism, and an increasingly distorted view of reality. Whether these characteristics reached the threshold of diagnosable mental illness, or whether they were personality traits that, while concerning, did not constitute psychiatric disorder, remains a matter of professional disagreement. This ambiguity highlights one of the challenges in preventing violence. Many perpetrators of mass violence do not have formal psychiatric diagnoses. They may have personality traits that make them difficult, isolated, or prone to grievance, but these traits are not mental illnesses that can be treated or that would justify involuntary intervention under civil liberties protections. The challenge is identifying when concerning behaviors cross a threshold that justifies action, and what form that action should take when criminal activity has not yet occurred and mental illness cannot be diagnosed. The Dunblane massacre occurred during a period when awareness of mass shootings was beginning to increase, but before such events became tragically common. In subsequent decades, the world has witnessed numerous mass shootings in schools, workplaces, and public spaces. Each has prompted similar cycles of grief, investigation, debate about prevention, and calls for policy changes. The specific responses have varied by country and context, but certain patterns recur. Perpetrators often exhibit warning signs, grievances are frequently present. Access to weapons enables the violence, and systemic failures to act on available information are common. What distinguishes Dunblane in this broader context is the decisive legislative response that followed, and the fact that Britain has not experienced another mass shooting in a school in the nearly 3 decades since. Whether this is primarily due to the firearms legislation, to improved child protection systems, to cultural factors, or to some combination of these elements is debated. However, the outcome is clear. Britain's experience post-Dunblane contrasts sharply with that of countries where school shootings have become a recurring horror. This contrast informs international debates about gun control, about school safety, and about the effectiveness of different policy approaches to preventing mass violence. Critics of the firearms ban argue that it represents an overreaction that penalized law-abiding gun owners while doing little to address the root causes of violence. They note that Hamilton could have killed with other weapons, that the ban affects only a small category of firearms, and that violent criminals do not obtain guns legally in any case. They argue that focusing on mental health, on threat assessment, and on identifying dangerous individuals would have been more effective than broad restrictions on gun ownership. These arguments continue to resonate with those who value gun ownership rights and who are skeptical of gun control measures. Proponents of the ban counter that the absence of subsequent school shootings speaks for itself. They argue that while Hamilton might have attempted violence with other weapons, the lethality of his attack was directly related to his use of multiple handguns with substantial ammunition capacity. They note that making certain weapons unavailable reduces, even if it does not eliminate, the capacity for mass killing. They argue that while no single policy provides complete protection, reducing access to the most lethal weapons is a necessary component of prevention. The debate continues, but in Britain itself, support for the handgun ban remains strong across the political spectrum. The legacy of Gwyneth Mayer and the 16 children who died extends beyond policy debates. Memorial funds established in the aftermath of the tragedy have supported children's causes and community projects in Dunblane and beyond. Schools across Britain have dedicated facilities and programs in memory of the victims. The annual Dunblane Memorial Service brings together families, survivors, and community members in private reflection. The memory of those lost serves as a reminder of innocence destroyed and of the imperative to protect children from violence. Survivors of the attack, now adults, have spoken in limited ways about their experiences. Some have no memory of the event itself, their young age at the time shielding them from conscious recollection, even as they cope with trauma that manifests in other ways. Others remember vividly and have struggled with those memories throughout their lives. Some have embraced advocacy work, using their status as survivors to promote gun control or school safety measures. Others have chosen privacy, seeking to build lives not defined by the worst moment of their childhood. Their experiences vary, but all carry the weight of survival, of knowing they were in that gymnasium that morning and emerged alive when others did not. The broader community of Dunblane has worked to honor the memory of the victims while also moving forward. The town has resisted becoming a site of dark tourism, has declined to mark the site with permanent public monuments that would draw spectators, and has tried to maintain dignity and privacy for those most affected. Local residents speak of the tragedy when asked, but do not dwell on it in daily life. Children grow up in Dunblane today, with awareness of what happened, but without the community being consumed by it. The balance between remembering and living, between honoring the dead and serving the living, has been consciously maintained. Dunblane is remembered for what happened that day, but it should also be remembered for what happened before it and what was ignored. The information about Thomas Hamilton's unsuitability to work with children existed in multiple forms across multiple organizations and agencies. Parents had complained. The Scout Association had excluded him. Police had investigated. The pattern was clear to those who looked for it, yet the system as constituted in 1996 did not facilitate looking, did not require integration of information, and did not provide mechanisms for preventive action when concerns fell short of criminal proof. The tragedy was not inevitable, but the conditions that allowed it were the product of systemic design rather than random chance. The lesson of Dunblane is not that all tragedies can be prevented, or that perfect security is achievable. It is that systems matter, that information sharing matters, that acting on patterns of concerning behavior matters, and that the absence of criminal proof should not be the only threshold for intervention when children's safety is at stake. The lesson is that organizations must communicate, that professionals must be empowered to act on legitimate concerns, and that policy must evolve in response to emerging threats rather than remaining static based on assumptions of safety that events may prove false. The reforms implemented after Dunblane represent Britain's attempt to learn from failure, to build better systems, and to prevent recurrence. No system is perfect. New threats emerge. Old problems persist in new forms. Vigilance cannot be assumed but must be actively maintained. The memory of 16 children and their teacher, cut down in a gymnasium in a small Scottish town on a March morning, serves as a permanent reminder of what is at stake when systems fail and when warning signs are not heeded. That memory drives continued efforts to protect children, to identify threats, and to act decisively when action is warranted. That memory, painful as it is, serves a purpose if it prevents future tragedies and saves future lives.